Sterile millionaire visits the grave of the wife he kicked out of his house 20 years ago. He turns pale upon seeing a 19-year-old boy crying at her tombstone. What he discovered shocked everyone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. It was a bitter December evening in Boston when Thaddeus Creighton slammed his crystal tumbler onto the mahogany desk, bourbon splashing onto imported papers. His face, typically composed for boardroom battles, contorted with rage and disbelief. "Pregnant?" The word escaped through clenched teeth. "And you expect me to believe this child is mine?" Elowen stood by the fireplace, hands protectively cradling her still flat stomach. Her emerald eyes, usually dancing with warmth, now shimmered with unshed tears. "Thaddeus, please. You know I've never been with anyone else. This is our miracle." His bitter laugh cut through the room's tension. "Miracle? I've been to every specialist in the country. The diagnosis was clear. I cannot father children. So tell me, Elowen, whose miracle are you carrying?" The grandfather clock ticked mercilessly as silence stretched between them. Outside, snow began to fall, coating Boston in deceptive tranquility. "I've loved you faithfully for 5 years," Elowen whispered. "I've never betrayed you." Thaddeus rose from his chair, towering over her slender frame. "My mother warned me about you, said you were after my fortune from the start." His voice dropped dangerously. "I should have listened." "Your mother never gave me a chance," Elowen replied, a rare flash of defiance crossing her features. "Just like you're not giving our child one." Thaddeus crossed to the safe hidden behind an original Monet, spinning the dial with practiced precision. He extracted a checkbook, scribbling with such force the pen nearly tore through the paper. "Here." He thrust the check toward her. "Take this and disappear. Consider it severance for services rendered." Elowen didn't even glance at the amount. "You think you can buy me off? Pay me to vanish with your child?" "Not my child," he corrected coldly. "And yes, that's exactly what I expect. Be gone by morning." As Elowen turned to leave, dignity somehow intact, Thaddeus added, "If you try to contact me or make any claims about this situation, my lawyers will bury you." The bedroom door closed quietly behind her, a final act of grace she didn't owe him. Thaddeus poured another drink, telling himself the hollow feeling in his chest was righteous anger, not doubt. By dawn, Elowen had vanished from his mansion and his life, taking only a small suitcase and the torn check, ripped to pieces in the wastebasket. Little did Thaddeus know that 19 years later, fate would bring him face to face with the truth he'd refused to see, beside a gravestone that would change everything. Boston's biting winter air cut through Elowen's thin coat as she wandered through unfamiliar streets, clutching her small suitcase. The majestic skyscrapers that once symbolized possibility now loomed like prison walls. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. $20. That's all she had withdrawn from the ATM before Thaddeus inevitably froze her access to their accounts. No home, no money, and a baby growing inside her, Thaddeus's baby, despite his cruel disbelief. "Think, Elowen," she whispered to herself, breath clouding in the frigid air. "You need to get out of Boston." She thought of her college roommate, Margaret, who lived in Chicago. They'd fallen out of touch, but Margaret had always been kind-hearted. It was a long shot, but the only one she had. At South Station bus terminal, the ticket agent's bored expression didn't change as he quoted the price. $127.50. Elowen's stomach dropped. She'd need to beg, something she'd never imagined doing. She approached travelers with rehearsed dignity, only to be met with averted gazes and uncomfortable rejections. "Everyone thinks I'm running a scam," she thought bitterly, hunger gnawing at her stomach. "Excuse me, miss, you okay?" An elderly man with weathered hands and kind eyes stood before her. Something in his expression reminded her of her late father. I need to get to Chicago," she stammered. "I have nowhere to go here." He studied her, not with suspicion, but with understanding. "I was homeless once," he said simply. "Lost everything in '87. Someone helped me when nobody else would." He reached into a worn wallet and handed her exact fare. Pay it forward someday, that's all I ask. The warmth of the bus couldn't thaw the numbness inside her. But as Boston disappeared behind her, Elowen allowed herself to breathe. She'd survive this. She had to. 18 hours later, exhausted and disoriented, she stood outside Margaret's apartment building in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. Her heart pounded as she knocked. The door swung open, revealing Margaret's familiar face, now lined with shock. Elowen. What on earth? I didn't know where else to go, Elowen whispered, voice breaking. Thaddeus threw me out. Margaret's expression softened as she noticed Elowen's protective hand over her stomach. Without a word, she pulled her into a tight embrace. Come inside, Margaret said firmly. You're safe now. The apartment was small but warm, filled with books and colorful throws. Margaret made tea while Elowen explained everything. The pregnancy, Thaddeus's accusations, her abrupt homelessness. That bastard, Margaret muttered. You deserve so much better. For the first time that day, Elowen's shoulders relaxed. I don't know what to do, Maggie. I have nothing. Margaret reached across the table, squeezing her hand. You have me, and you have that baby. We'll figure this out together. That night, curled under borrowed blankets on Margaret's sofa, Elowen whispered to her unborn child, We're going to be okay. I promise you that. She didn't know how yet, but somewhere between Boston and Chicago, determination had replaced despair. Thaddeus had taken everything except what mattered most, her dignity and the precious life growing inside her. Elowen stared at her reflection in Margaret's bathroom mirror, her hand resting on the slight curve of her stomach that had begun to show in the past few weeks. She looked different, thinner in the face, her eyes carrying a new wariness, but there was something else too. A quiet resolve. You can't hide in my apartment forever, Margaret had told her gently that morning over breakfast. Not that I mind, having you here, but you need your own life, Elle, for yourself and for the baby. She was right. 3 weeks had passed since Elowen had arrived in Chicago, and while Margaret's generosity had been a lifeline, Elowen knew she couldn't build a future on borrowed space and borrowed time. The classified section of the Chicago Tribune lay open on the kitchen table, circled listings creating a roadmap of possibilities. Elowen had been methodically calling each one, only to hear the same responses. No experience, positions filled, or the hesitant pause when she mentioned she was pregnant. Don't give up, Margaret encouraged, squeezing her shoulder before leaving, for her teaching job. Something will work out. By afternoon, Elowen had worked up the courage to walk into Sullivan's Diner, a modest establishment with a help wanted sign perpetually displayed in its window. The bell chimed as she entered, the scent of coffee and grilled onions filling her senses. What can I get you? Asked a stern-looking woman behind the counter, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Actually, Elowen cleared her throat. I'm here about the job. The woman, Nancy Sullivan, as Elowen would later learn, gave her a critical once-over, eyes lingering momentarily on Elowen's midsection. Ever worked in food service before? No, Elowen admitted. But I'm a fast learner and She paused, swallowing her pride. I really need this job. Nancy wiped her hands on her apron. It's hard work. Customers can be demanding. Pay's not great. I understand. When can you start? The simple question nearly brought tears to Elowen's eyes. Immediately, Nancy nodded curtly. Tomorrow, 6 a.m., don't be late. That evening, Elowen celebrated with Margaret, the two of them, sharing a cheap bottle of sparkling cider in lieu of champagne. First step toward independence, Margaret toasted. I'm proud of you, Elle. I don't know how to thank you, Elowen said softly. When I showed up at your door, that's what friends do, Margaret interrupted. Besides, you'd have done the same for me. The next morning, Elowen awoke before dawn, nervous energy propelling her through her preparations. The diner was all ready, bustling when she arrived, truckers and early shift workers crowding the counter. Here, Nancy thrust an apron at her. Tables 7 through 14 are yours. Coffee's always fresh, specials are on the board, and don't let anyone talk down to you. The learning curve was steep. Elowen dropped a tray of dishes, mixed up orders, and endured the impatience of hungry customers. By mid-morning, her feet ached and her back screamed in protest, but she refused to show weakness. During a rare lull, Nancy appeared beside her as she refilled salt shakers. "You're doing better than I expected," she said. It wasn't exactly effusive praise, but Elowen felt a small glow of accomplishment. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she replied. Nancy's eyes softened slightly. "How far along are you?" "Almost 4 months." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "My sister's an OB nurse at County. I'll get you her information. You'll need prenatal care." The unexpected kindness brought a lump to Elowen's throat. "I appreciate that." Days melted into weeks and a routine emerged. Elowen worked morning shifts at Sullivan's, saving every dollar possible. Her small tips went into a mason jar labeled Baby, Fund in Margaret's neat handwriting. At night, she scoured community newsletters for resources, secondhand baby furniture, free clinics, parenting classes. On her first day off, Elowen visited the Chicago Women's Resource Center, where a counselor named Regina helped her apply for emergency medical assistance and connected her with a support group for single mothers. "You're not the first woman to start over," Regina told her, handing her a thick folder of information. "And you won't be the last. But you're doing all the right things." That evening, sitting on Margaret's fire escape and watching the sunset cast golden light across the city, Elowen felt the baby move for the first time. A gentle flutter like butterfly wings. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I promise I'll give you a good life, no matter what." Back in Boston, Thaddeus Crichton's business empire continued to flourish. His divorce from Elowen was finalized quickly, her absence making the proceedings almost laughably simple. He told himself he felt nothing but relief as he signed the final papers, ignoring the hollow ache that had taken residence beneath his breastbone. In quiet moments, doubt sometimes crept. What if she had been telling the truth? What if the doctors had been wrong? But he banished these thoughts quickly, focusing instead on acquisition deals and profit margins. He never looked for her, never tried to find out where she'd gone, or if she'd had the baby. In his mind, that chapter was closed, the pages torn, out and burned. What he didn't realize was that someday, those ashes would rise again, reforming into a truth he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Elowen Crichton, who had resumed using her maiden name Bennett, was building a future, brick by persistent brick. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but as she glanced at the sonogram picture taped to Margaret's refrigerator, she felt something unexpected: hope. 6 months into her new life in Chicago, Elowen had settled into a rhythm that sustained her, if not fulfilled her. Her days at Sullivan's Diner had earned her a modest reputation for efficiency and quiet dignity. Regular customers now requested her section, leaving generous tips that she faithfully added to her growing savings. But as her pregnancy progressed, reality pressed in like the tightening waistband of her uniform. Her back ached constantly from hours on her feet, and Nancy had begun giving her concerned glances when she thought Elowen wasn't looking. "You need a plan beyond waiting tables," Margaret said one evening as they browsed through a second-hand baby store. "Something that can support you and the baby long term." Elowen ran her fingers over a tiny blue sweater. "I know, but what? I never finished my degree, and no one's exactly lining up to hire a pregnant woman with no experience." "There are programs," Margaret insisted. "Job training, certification courses, things that could give you better options." That night, while Margaret graded papers, Elowen pored over community college brochures and workforce development pamphlets. One particular program caught her eye: medical office administration. The training was only 8 months, offered evening classes, and boasted a 90% job placement rate. "This one," she told Margaret, tapping the brochure. "I could do this." The program cost was modest but still beyond her current means. Undeterred, Elowen made an appointment with a counselor at the community college. Lisa, the program advisor, listened to Elowen's situation with practiced compassion. There are scholarships for single mothers, she explained, and payment plans. We can make this work if you're committed. I am, Elowen said firmly. I need to build something better. 2 weeks later, Elowen began attending evening classes 3 times a week after her diner shifts. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but each completed assignment felt like a victory, each passing grade a step away from the desperate woman who had arrived in Chicago with nothing but a suitcase and unborn child. At Sullivan's, Nancy adjusted her schedule to accommodate her classes, a kindness Elowen hadn't expected. My mother raised 4 kids by herself, Nancy explained gruffly. Anyone trying to better themselves deserves a chance. By her 8th month of pregnancy, Elowen's study schedule had become a challenge. Her ankles swelled, and the plastic chairs in the community college classrooms were instruments of torture, but she persisted, completing assignments between customer orders and studying flashcards during her breaks. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met, Margaret remarked one night, finding Elowen asleep at the kitchen table, face pressed against an open textbook. Margaret had transformed their shared living room into a makeshift nursery, decorating it with yard sale finds and hand-me-downs from fellow teachers. A crib stood in the corner, a mobile of fabric stars hanging above it, each one sewn by Margaret during their evening conversations. It's not much, Margaret apologized, but it's a start. It's everything, Elowen whispered, overcome with gratitude. On a crisp October morning, Elowen's water broke while she was refilling the diner's sugar dispensers. Nancy drove her to the hospital herself, cursing at traffic and running 2 red lights. Don't you dare have this baby in my Buick, she warned, but her hand gripped Elowen's with reassuring strength. 16 hours later, Callum Bennett entered the world. 7 pounds of perfection with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they finally opened, were the unmistakable Creighton blue. Holding him in her arms, Elowen felt a fierce protective love that transcended the pain of the past. Hello, my darling, she whispered. We made it. Margaret and Nancy took turns visiting, bringing practical gifts and taking photos that Elowen cherished. There were no grandparents cooing over the new arrival, no proud father passing out cigars. But there was love, abundant and fierce. Across the country, oblivious to his son's birth, Thaddeus Creighton closed a record-breaking real estate deal and celebrated alone in his penthouse office, ignoring the persistent emptiness that success could never seem to fill. The winter after Callum's birth was the coldest Chicago had seen in decades. Elowen would bundle her son in layers of second-hand clothing before venturing out to her classes, grateful that Nancy had allowed her to return to the diner on a reduced schedule. Between work, school, and motherhood, sleep became a luxury she rarely afforded herself. On particularly brutal evenings, Margaret would insist on watching Callum so Elowen could attend her classes without dragging the infant through the snow. These moments of separation, though practical, tore at Elowen's heart. He won't even remember you were gone, Margaret reassured her. And you're doing this for him. Elowen knew she was right, but the guilt persisted, a familiar companion in her new life. It whispered that she wasn't enough, couldn't provide enough, should somehow be more than what she was. In quiet moments, she wondered if this was how single mothers had felt throughout history, constantly divided, perpetually inadequate. Yet, there were moments of pure joy that made everything worthwhile. Callum's first smile, a gummy lopsided grin that appeared one morning as she sang to him while changing his diaper, his fascination with the dust motes dancing in sunlight, the weight of his small body against her chest as he slept, perfect and trusting. One evening, while studying for her final exams, Elowen sat with Callum in her lap, bouncing him gently while trying to memorize medical billing codes. Frustrated by her divided attention, he began to fuss, his little face screwing, up in preparation for a full-throated wail. Shh, shh, Cal, she murmured, setting aside her flashcards. I know. Mama's right here. She lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back rhythmically, when suddenly she felt his tiny hand pat her shoulder in return, deliberately, mimicking her motion. Something about this small gesture, this first communication of "I hear you, I'm responding to you," broke through her exhaustion and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Cal," she whispered, "you and me, we're going to be just fine." That night, she wrote in the Weir journal she'd been keeping since his birth. "Today, my son reached back for me. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. He's becoming a person, not just a baby. Someone with thoughts and feelings and ways of showing me he understands. I wonder if this is how all parents feel. This wonder, this terror, this overwhelming love. Does Thaddeus ever wonder about us? Does he ever feel the emptiness of what he's missing? I hope someday Callum won't feel that emptiness too deeply. I hope being loved by me will be enough." As winter melted into spring, Allowin's determination hardened into something unbreakable. She took extra shifts when she could, studied during Callum's naps, and aced her certification exams with scores that impressed even her instructors. Her program director began sending her job postings, confident that Allowin would be an asset to any medical office. Meanwhile, in Boston, Thaddeus Creighton's empire continued its relentless expansion. He had opened offices in 3 new cities, acquired a failing competitor at a fraction of its worth, and been featured in Forbes magazine as one of America's most eligible bachelors. The article mentioned his previous marriage in passing as a brief union dissolved before children could complicate matters. Reading this in his office late one night, Thaddeus felt an unexpected pang. He hadn't allowed himself to think of Allowin in months, had trained himself to skip over memories of their life together like commercials during a television program. But something about seeing their marriage reduced to a footnote in his success story disturbed him. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, what had become of her. Had she kept the child? Was it a boy or a girl? Had she found someone else to love, someone who could give her what she wanted? These thoughts felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. He shut them down quickly, pouring himself another scotch, and turning to the quarterly projections that demanded his attention. Real estate developments didn't build themselves on sentiment or regret. Back in Chicago, Allowin received an offer from Lakeside Pediatrics, a well-established practice in Lincoln Park. The salary was modest but steady, with benefits that included health insurance for both her and Callum. The office manager had been impressed by her certifications and unfazed by her single motherhood, a combination Allowin hadn't dared hope for. That evening, she and Margaret celebrated with a rare splurge, takeout from the Thai restaurant down the street and a bottle of inexpensive wine. "To new beginnings," Margaret toasted, glasses clinking in the small kitchen. "And to the friends who make them possible," Allowin added, her gratitude beyond words. Later, watching Callum sleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, Allowin felt something she hadn't experienced since before that fateful night in Boston. Hope. Not just the desperate hope of survival, but the warm, expanding hope of possibility. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to her sleeping son, a promise she finally believed she could keep. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Allowin's position at Lakeside Pediatrics had evolved from front desk coordinator to office manager, her quiet competence earning the respect of doctors and patients alike. The modest raises and annual bonuses had allowed her to finally move out of Margaret's apartment and into a small 2-bedroom unit in a family-friendly neighborhood. Their new home wasn't impressive by Boston standards, certainly nothing like the mansion she'd once shared with Thaddeus, but it was theirs. A place where Callum could have his own room with walls she'd painted sky blue one weekend, where toys could scatter across the living room floor without apology, where photographs of their little family lined the hallway. On Callum's 5th birthday, Allowin surprised him with a second-hand bicycle. Its red paint slightly chipped, but its training wheels sturdy. His face, lighting up with that particular joy that only children can express, was worth every extra shift she'd taken to afford it. "Can we go try it now, Mama? Please?" he begged, already attempting to wheel it toward the door. "Of course we can, birthday boy," she laughed, grabbing her keys. At the park, she watched him pedal unsteadily along the pathway, his dark hair, so like hers, ruffling in the breeze. But those eyes, sharp and blue as winter ice, were all Thaddeus. Sometimes it took her breath away, seeing his father looking back at her through Callum's innocent gaze. "Watch me, Mama," he called, gaining confidence with each wobbly circuit. "I see you, my love. You're doing wonderfully." Later that evening, after birthday cake with Margaret and Nancy, who had become something of a surrogate grandmother, though she'd deny it fiercely, Elowen tucked an exhausted Callum into bed. "Mama?" he asked sleepily. "Tommy at school says, everyone has a dad. Where's mine?" The question she'd been preparing for since his birth still landed like a punch. Elowen sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. "Your father lives far away in Boston. He's a businessman who builds tall buildings." "Why doesn't he live with us?" Elowen stroked his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand. Before you were born, your father and I couldn't stay together. But that has nothing to do with you. Doesn't he want to meet me?" "Oh, Cal." She sighed, heartbreaking. "Your father made choices a long time ago, but you have me and Aunt Margaret and even grumpy Ms. Nancy who sneaks you cookies when she thinks I'm not looking." Callum seemed to consider this, his eyelids growing heavy. "I wish he knew me. Someday perhaps he will," she whispered, though she had no intention of ever reaching out to Thaddeus. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ashes. Across the country, Thaddeus Creighton celebrated the completion of his latest skyscraper with an exclusive rooftop party. At 52, he remained one of Boston's most eligible bachelors, though the glamour of that title had long since faded. His relationships never lasted. Women were attracted to his wealth and power, but eventually grew tired of his emotional distance, his obsession with work, his inability to truly connect. Sometimes, in rare moments of honesty, he acknowledged the emptiness of his achievements. Towers of glass and steel meant nothing when you returned to an echoing penthouse each night. But it was easier to build another building than to examine the ruins of what might have been. By the time Callum turned 10, he had grown into a thoughtful boy with a quick mind and gentle spirit. His room was filled with library books about architecture and tall buildings, an interest that sometimes made Elowen's heart ache with its unknowing connection to his father. "Mom, look at this one," Callum exclaimed one evening, pointing to a photograph of a sleek skyscraper in a borrowed architecture book. "It says Creighton Enterprises built it last year. That's my last name too, right? Before you changed it back to Bennett?" Elowen paused, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest whenever Thaddeus edged into their conversations. "Yes, that was my married name. So my dad built this?" His blue eyes, so achingly familiar, lit up with unexpected pride. "His company did," she answered carefully. "Your father is successful in business." Callum studied the building's image thoughtfully. "Do you think he builds models first?" "I could do that. Ms. Wilson says I'm good at my science projects." Elowen smiled, ruffling his hair. "You're good at everything you set your mind to, Cal. That comes from both of us." These moments, the innocent questions, the natural curiosity, about half his heritage, never got easier. But Elowen had made a promise to herself long ago. She would never lie to Callum about Thaddeus, nor would she poison him with bitterness. The story she told was simplified but true. His father had doubted he was his, had made choices that separated them, lived a different life far away. What she kept to herself were the darker details. How Thaddeus had cruelly dismissed her. How he'd accused her of infidelity. How he'd offered money to make her disappear. Some truths were too heavy for a child's shoulders. Despite, or perhaps because of, Thaddeus's absence, Elowen was determined that Callum would grow up understanding the values that truly mattered. She taught him through example, working diligently, treating others with kindness, finding joy in simple pleasures. Their Saturday routine became sacred. Volunteering at the local animal shelter in the morning, Callum's gentle way with nervous dogs was remarkable, then to the farmer's market for fresh vegetables, an afternoon spent cooking together or visiting museums with discount passes from the library. Money remained tight, but Elowen managed it carefully. Callum's school clothes came from thrift stores, but were always clean and well-mended. Birthday parties were small but creative. Christmas presents might be few, but they were chosen with thoughtful care. When Callum's school assigned a family tree project, Elowen helped him place Thaddeus's name on the appropriate branch, along with unknown for Thaddeus's parents. She had never met them, had only heard cold stories from a husband who rarely spoke of his childhood. "Maybe someday I'll meet him," Callum said matter-of-factly as they worked on the project. "And then I can fill in more branches." Elowen's hand faltered, smudging a pencil line. "Maybe," she said, not wanting to crush his hope while knowing how unlikely such a meeting would be. "But you know, Cal, families aren't just about branches on trees. They're about who loves you, who shows up, who makes your life better by being in it." "Like Aunt Margaret and Ms. Nancy?" "Exactly like them," she smiled, grateful for the family they had built from friendship rather than blood. That night, watching Callum sleep, Elowen marveled at how completely this child had changed her. Before him, she had been a woman defined by what she'd lost. After him, she became someone defined by what she'd found, strength she never knew she possessed, joy in the smallest moments, purpose beyond herself. Whatever Thaddeus might be building in Boston, it couldn't compare to what she was building here, a human being with both compassion and courage, a boy who might someday become the kind of man his father had never been. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the Columbia University insignia crisp against the heavy cream envelope. Elowen stared at it, balanced on their kitchen counter, waiting for Callum to return from his final day of high school. 19 years had passed since she'd fled Boston with nothing. Now her son, brilliant, kind-hearted Callum, stood on the threshold of possibilities she'd once only dreamed of providing for him. When the front door finally opened, Elowen's heart quickened. Callum appeared, all 6 feet of him, looking so grown up in his faded jeans and flannel shirt that sometimes she still couldn't believe it. "It came," she said simply, nodding toward the envelope. Callum froze, his blue eyes, those inescapable Creighton eyes, widening. "Is that?" "Columbia," she confirmed. "Your first choice." His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. "I can't open it. You do it." Elowen shook her head. "This is your moment, Cal, whatever it says." She watched as he tore the seal, unfolded the letter, his expression shifting from tension to disbelief to pure joy. "I got in," he whispered. "Full scholarship." The pride that surged through Elowen was overwhelming. This brilliant young man, her son, had earned his way into one of the country's most prestigious universities, not through family connections or wealth, but through his own merit. "I knew you could do it," she said, voice thick with emotion as she hugged him. "I've always known." Later that evening, after the initial excitement had settled, after calls to Margaret and Nancy sharing the news, after a celebratory dinner of Callum's favorite pasta, the reality began to sink in. Columbia was in New York, not Boston, but still the East Coast. Still closer to Thaddeus than Callum had ever been. "You know," Callum said quietly as they washed dishes together. "I looked it up. Creighton Enterprises has offices in New York." Elowen's hand stilled in the soapy water. "Cal, I'm not saying I'll contact him," he continued carefully. I thought you should know I'm aware." She nodded, resuming her task with deliberate focus. "It's your life, Cal. Your choice. You're old enough to make your own decisions about that." "Would it hurt you if I did? Try to meet him someday?" The question hung between them, honest and unavoidable. Elowen dried her hand slowly, turning to face her son. "Nothing could change how much I love you," she said finally. "And nothing could change how proud I am of the person you've become. That said, I can't pretend it wouldn't be complicated for me." Callum nodded, understanding passing between them. "I don't even know if I want to. I just feel like there's this blank space." "I know," she whispered, cupping his cheek. I've tried to fill it as best I could." "You did," he said fiercely. "You filled it with everything important." The summer passed too quickly, a blur of preparation and anticipation. Alawan helped Callum shop for dorm essentials, research textbooks, plan his course schedule. She kept her fears to herself, fears about money despite the scholarship, fears about him being so far from home, fears about what might happen if he crossed paths with the Crichton name and legacy. On move-in day, standing in his tiny dorm, Alawan fought to keep her composure. This separation was inevitable, healthy, exactly what she'd worked so hard to make possible. Yet it felt like her heart was being torn in two. "Call me anytime," she said, straightening his bedspread, unnecessarily, day or night. "I will, Mom," he promised, patient with her fussing. Their goodbye in front of the residence hall was brief. Callum was eager to begin his new chapter, and Alawan determined not to burden him with her emotions. Only later, alone on the train, back to Chicago, did she allow herself to cry. Quiet tears for all they'd overcome together and for the uncertain future that awaited him in a city where his father's name adorned buildings like flags of conquest. Columbia University buzzed with autumn energy as Callum settled into his first semester. His architectural design course quickly became his favorite, his natural talent earning praise from professors who didn't know the irony of his innate understanding of structural principles. On a brisk October afternoon, Callum was walking through Lower Manhattan with his roommate Tyler when he stopped abruptly, his attention caught by a massive gleaming tower. "Whoa," said Tyler, following his gaze. "Impressive, right? That's the Crichton Financial Center. Just finished last year." Callum stood frozen, staring at his father's name emblazoned in sleek metal letters across the entrance. "Yeah," he managed. "Impressive. You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Callum murmured. That night, alone in his dorm room, Callum opened his laptop and typed Thaddeus Crichton into the search bar. He'd done this before, of course, but always furtively, always with a sense of betraying his mother. This time felt different, more urgent, more necessary. The search results cascaded across his screen. Forbes profiles, Wall Street Journal interviews, real estate development news. Images showed a distinguished man in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, always impeccably dressed, often alone despite being photographed at social events. An article from Boston Business Monthly caught his attention. Thaddeus Crichton, the solitary empire builder. He clicked, scanning the profile that painted his father as brilliant but isolated, respected but feared, successful but seemingly unfulfilled. Despite 2 failed marriages, the article noted, Crichton remains childless with no apparent heir to his considerable fortune. Childless. The word struck Callum like a physical blow. He existed, yet in the official narrative of Thaddeus Crichton's life, he didn't. Further research revealed Crichton Enterprises had offices just 15 blocks from his dormitory. The proximity felt both terrifying and magnetic, as if some invisible force was pulling them into the same orbit after years of separation. The next morning, Callum found himself walking past the Crichton building, studying the people entering and exiting, wondering if any of them knew his father personally, wondering if they would see the resemblance if they looked at him closely enough. He continued this routine for days, drawn back repeatedly, gathering courage. He told no one, not Tyler, not his new college friends, and certainly not his mother, during their regular phone calls. "How are classes?" Alawan would ask, and he'd describe his projects in detail, omitting the fact that he was designing them with techniques he'd gleaned from studying his father's buildings. "Are you eating properly?" She'd worry, and he'd assure her about dining hall meals, not mentioning that he'd lost his appetite since discovering the Crichton building. Finally, on a rain-soaked Friday, Callum made a decision. Dressed in his best clothes, dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and the blazer his mother had saved for months to buy him as a graduation gift, he entered the Crichton Enterprises lobby. The interior was exactly what he'd imagined: soaring ceilings, marble floors, Tasteful artwork that probably cost more than his mother's annual salary. At the reception desk, a polished woman in her 40s looked up expectantly. "May I help you?" she asked. Callum's heart thundered in his chest, blood rushing in his ears. He thought of his mother, of her sacrifices, of her quiet strength. He thought of the blank spaces in his family tree, the questions that had haunted him since childhood. He thought of the man whose name adorned this building, whose blood ran in his veins, whose rejection had shaped his life from before he was born. "Yes," he said, finding his voice at last. "I need to see Thaddeus Crichton." Her perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Callum admitted, "but he'll want to see me." "And you are." Callum straightened, the weight of 19 years settling onto his shoulders as he spoke the words he'd never said aloud before. "I'm his son." The receptionist's professional mask slipped momentarily, her eyes widening before she regained composure. "I'll see if Mr. Crichton is available. Your name, please?" "Callum Bennett." She disappeared through sleek glass doors, leaving Callum alone with his thundering heartbeat. The lobby's hushed atmosphere felt suffocating. Business people passed through, their curious glances making him acutely aware of his youth, his outsider status. Minutes stretched agonizingly before the doors reopened. A security officer emerged, tall, stern-faced, with an earpiece and dark suit. "Mr. Crichton will see you," he said without emotion. "Follow me." Callum's legs felt wooden as he followed the man through a maze of corridors and past curious employees. They reached an elevator requiring a key card, ascending silently to the top floor. The executive suite occupied the entire level, minimalist, powerful, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Manhattan's skyline. At the far end, behind a massive desk of dark wood, sat Thaddeus Crichton. Seeing him in person, not in photographs or imagination, knocked the air from Callum's lungs. The resemblance was undeniable. The same jawline, the same piercing blue eyes, even the way his hands rested on the desk. Fingers splayed slightly, commanding space. Time seemed suspended as father and son regarded each other across the expanse of gleaming hardwood and unspoken history. "Leave us," Thaddeus instructed the security officer, who nodded and retreated silently. When they were alone, Thaddeus spoke first, his voice controlled but with an underlying tension. "My receptionist says you claim to be my son." Callum swallowed, finding his voice. "I am your son." "I don't have a son." "Because you chose not to," Callum replied, stronger now. "My mother is Elowen Bennett. You knew her as Elowen Crichton before you threw her out 19 years ago for being pregnant with me." Thaddeus's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or calculation. "What do you want?" "Money?" The question stung more than Callum had anticipated. "I don't want your money. I'm here on full scholarship, at Columbia." "Then what? Some kind of recognition, family connection?" Callum moved closer to the desk, studying the man who had contributed half his DNA yet remained a stranger. "I wanted to see you, to understand how someone could abandon their own child without a second thought." Thaddeus rose slowly, walking to the window. For a moment he seemed to age before Callum's eyes, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight. "You think I never thought about it?" he asked quietly. "Never wondered?" "If you wondered, you could have found us. Mom never hid." Thaddeus turned, his gaze clinical as he assessed Callum. "You have her coloring, her chin." A pause. "My eyes. And your talent for architecture, apparently," Callum said. "I'm studying structural design at Columbia." Something unreadable crossed Thaddeus's face. "That's interesting." "Was it worth it?" Callum asked suddenly. "Building all this while missing everything about me? My first steps, my graduations, my whole life?" Thaddeus returned to his desk, resuming control. "I made a decision based on information I had at the time. I believed your mother had been unfaithful." "And you never questioned that belief? Never once thought you might be wrong?" "By the time I had. Doubts, years had passed. What was I supposed to do? Disrupt the life you and your mother had built? Callum laughed without humor. Is that how you justify it? That you were doing us a favor by staying away? Thaddeus's jaw tightened. You don't understand the complexities. No, I understand perfectly, Callum interrupted. You chose your empire over your family, your pride over the truth. He turned to leave, suddenly exhausted by the encounter that had consumed his imagination for years. Callum, Thaddeus called, stopping him at the door. Does Elowen know you're here? Callum met his father's gaze one last time. No, and she's spent 19 years making sure I never needed you. I just needed to see for myself what kind of man walks away from his child. He left without looking back, the weight of unresolved history heavy on his shoulders as the elevator descended, carrying him away from the father who had never been his, back to a world forever changed by their meeting. Callum walked for hours, through Manhattan's grid, oblivious to the autumn chill, his mind replaying every second of the encounter with Thaddeus. The man had been exactly as he'd imagined, cold, calculating, defensive, yet somehow entirely different too. There had been moments when something almost like regret had flickered across his father's face, quickly masked behind practiced indifference. By nightfall, Callum found himself in Central Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the reservoir. His phone had been vibrating periodically in his pocket, probably Tyler wondering where he'd disappeared to, maybe his mother checking in. The thought of Elowen sent a wave of guilt through him. She deserved to know what he'd done, but he couldn't bear to tell her over the phone. When he finally checked his messages, his suspicions were confirmed. 3 texts from Tyler about study group, and 2 missed calls from his mother. With cold fingers, he dialed her number. Callum, her voice came through, warm with relief. I was getting worried. Sorry, Mom. I was out and lost track of time. You sound strange. Is everything okay? He'd never been able to hide anything from her. Even across hundreds of miles, she could read his moods like weather patterns. He began, then faltered. I did something I should tell you about. The silence on the other end was expectant, patient. Elowen had always given him space to find his words. I went to see him, Callum finally said. Thaddeus, my father. The sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. I see. And how did that go? About as well as you'd expect, he said, attempting humor that fell flat. He didn't deny I was his son, at least not after he got a good look at me. But he didn't exactly welcome me with open arms either. Oh, Cal, she sighed, and he could picture her closing her eyes, gathering her thoughts. I always knew this day might come. I just hoped that I wouldn't go looking for answers that would hurt me. He finished for her. Something like that, she admitted. Was it? Did you get what you needed from the meeting? Callum watched the city lights shimmer on the water's surface, considering her question. Not really. I thought I'd feel something. Closure, anger, connection, something. But I just felt empty. Like I'd built this moment up in my mind for years and the reality was so much smaller than my imagination. That's often true about the monsters under our beds, she said softly. He's so cold, Mom. So contained. Is that what he was like when you knew him? A long pause followed. Not always, she finally said. When we first met, he could be passionate, focused, even kind in his way. But success changed him. Or maybe it just magnified what was already there. His ambition, his self-protection, his inability to trust. He said he had doubts about whether I was his, but he never looked for us. No, she confirmed. He never did. Callum felt a lump forming in his throat. How could he not want to know? How could he build all these structures that will last for generations but not care about his own flesh and blood? Some people aren't capable of giving the kind of love a child deserves, Elowen said gently. It's not about you, Cal. It never was. It was about his limitations, not yours. I told him I didn't want his money. Callum continued. But I think that's all he thought I could possibly want from him. Like there couldn't be any other reason to seek him out. That's how he understands the world, she explained. Through transactions and assets. It's sad, really. Callum nodded, though she couldn't see him. I kept waiting to feel this. I don't. No cosmic connection. Some recognition in my blood, but there was nothing, just a stranger with my eyes. Are you disappointed? She asked, her voice thick with concern. No, he realized, surprising himself. No, I think I'm relieved. I've spent so long wondering about this missing piece, this shadow hanging over my life. But now I've seen him, talk to him, and he's just a man. A successful, lonely man who made choices he can't unmake. The weight that had been pressing on Callum's chest since entering the Creighton building began to lift. He took a deep breath of crisp night air. You were enough, Mom, he said suddenly, fiercely. You've always been enough. More than enough. I need you to know that. On the other end of the line, he heard a soft sniffle. That means everything to me, Cal, she whispered. They talked a while longer, about his classes, about her work, about normal things that tethered them across the distance. When they finally said goodnight, Callum felt a peace he hadn't expected to find on this tumultuous day. Walking back to campus, he realized something profound had shifted inside him. For 19 years, he'd been defined partly by absence. The missing father, the unanswered questions, the blank spaces in his history. But that emptiness no longer felt like a void that needed filling. It was just a fact, like the color of his hair or the shape of his hands. Thaddeus Creighton had given him life and then walked away, but Alawan Bennett had given him everything else: love, values, strength, and the wisdom to recognize what truly mattered. Thanksgiving arrived with unseasonable warmth in Chicago. Alawan had spent the morning preparing a modest feast: turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and the pumpkin pie that had become their tradition. The apartment was filled with comforting aromas when Callum's key turned in the lock. Mom, he called, dropping his duffel bag in the entryway. Alawan wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to embrace him. 3 months of college had changed him subtly. A new confidence in his posture, a sharper definition to his features, the beginnings of adulthood settling on his shoulders. Look at you, she said, stepping back to take him in. College agrees with you. It's good to be home, he smiled, following her to the kitchen where he immediately began helping, falling into their old rhythms. They worked side by side, catching up on small things: his architectural projects, her promotion at the medical office, Margaret's new boyfriend, Nancy's hip replacement. Neither mentioned Thaddeus directly, though his shadow lingered between them. Later, after dinner was cleared away, they settled on the couch with mugs of cider. The comfortable silence between them had always been one of Alawan's favorite things. How they could simply exist together, without the pressure of filling space. I've been thinking a lot, Callum said finally, about our phone call, after I saw him. Alawan nodded, giving him space to continue. I keep wondering if I was wrong to go there, if I betrayed you somehow. She set her mug down, turning to face him fully. Cal, you didn't betray me. You were seeking answers about your own life, your own history. That's natural. But after everything you did for us, everything you sacrificed, listen to me, she interrupted gently. I never wanted you to spend your life wondering. I never wanted Thaddeus to have that kind of power over you. The power of the unknown. Callum studied his hands, so like hers in shape but larger, stronger. When I was sitting in his office looking at everything he'd built, I kept thinking about what you built instead. It wasn't skyscrapers or companies, but it was so much more important. Oh, Cal, she whispered. He asked if you knew I was there, Callum continued. I think he was worried you'd sent me to, I don't know, confront him on your behalf or something. Alawan smiled sadly. That would be his perspective, seeing everything as a potential attack, a transaction, a power play. Were you ever tempted to go back, to show him he was wrong? She considered this, tracing the rim of her mug thoughtfully. In the early days, yes, I fantasized about returning successful, proving him wrong. But as time passed, I realized something important. Proving him wrong meant he was still defining my choices. True freedom came when I stopped measuring my life against his expectations. That's what I felt, walking out of his office. Callum nodded, like I was finally free of this ghost I'd been carrying. They sat in comfortable silence again before Callum spoke once more. I think I understand now why you never told me the worst parts. About how he treated you when you told him about me. Elowen raised an eyebrow. How did you know there were worse parts? Because I met him, Callum said simply. And because no matter how bad the story got when you told it, you never seemed angry enough for someone who'd just been abandoned. You were protecting me from the full truth. Elowen reached for his hand. You deserve to form your own opinions without my pain coloring your perspective. And you deserve to know your father through your own eyes, not mine. That's what makes you different from him, Callum said with sudden clarity. He made every choice thinking only of himself. You made every choice thinking of me. As they embraced, Elowen felt 19 years of tension begin to dissolve. Her son had faced his ghost and emerged stronger. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, just as they always had. February painted New York in shades of gray. Callum hurried across campus, collar turned up against the biting wind, mind occupied with midterm projects and looming deadlines. His phone vibrated in his pocket, likely Tyler asking about their study session. But the number on the screen was unfamiliar. New York area code. Hello? He answered cautiously. Callum Bennett? A woman's voice, professionally detached. Yes, that's me. I'm calling from the office of Thaddeus Crichton. He'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Callum stopped walking, students streaming around him like water around a stone. Why? I'm not at liberty to discuss details. Would tomorrow at 3 p.m. be possible? His instinct was to refuse, to protect the peace he'd found since their last encounter. But curiosity prevailed. Fine. Tomorrow at 3. The Crichton building seemed different this time. Less intimidating, merely glass and steel constructed by human hands. As before, security escorted him to the top floor, but something felt off. The employees they passed seemed subdued, exchanging glances as he walked by. Thaddeus wasn't behind his imposing desk. Instead, Callum found him by the window, gazing out at the skyline, looking somehow diminished. Thank you for coming, Thaddeus said without turning, his voice rougher than Callum remembered. Your assistant was persuasive, Callum replied cautiously. Thaddeus turned then, and Callum struggled to mask his shock. In just 4 months, his father had aged years. The distinguished silver hair had thinned, the sharp features hollowed, the commanding presence replaced by something fragile. Please sit. Thaddeus gestured to a seating area rather than the formal desk arrangement. Once settled, Thaddeus got straight to the point. I have pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The prognosis is limited. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Callum felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it. I'm sorry, he said finally, meaning it. I've been thinking about our conversation, Thaddeus continued. About choices and consequences. When death becomes more than theoretical, priorities have a way of clarifying themselves. Callum remained silent, watching this man, his father by blood but stranger by choice, struggle with words that didn't come easily to him. I was wrong, Thaddeus said simply. About your mother. About you. I've been wrong for 19 years. Why? Tell me this now? Callum asked, wary of deathbed manipulations. Because I don't have the luxury of time anymore. Thaddeus's hands, once steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts, trembled slightly. And because I'd like the chance to know my son before I go. What exactly are you asking for? Thaddeus met his gaze directly. Conversation, nothing more. I don't expect forgiveness or affection, just the opportunity to know something about you beyond the fact of your existence. Callum studied the man before him, powerful yet powerless, accomplished yet failing at what mattered most. He thought of his mother, who had never sought revenge, who had taught him that compassion wasn't weakness. "I have class on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said finally. "I could come on Monday afternoons." Relief washed over Thaddeus's haggard features. "That would be acceptable. Thank you." As Callum stood to leave, Thaddeus asked quietly, "Will you tell Elowen?" The question carried layers of meaning. Would Elowen try to stop these meetings? Would she feel betrayed? Had Thaddeus earned even the acknowledgement of his impending death? "Yes," Callum said firmly. "We don't keep secrets from each other." Descending, in the elevator, Callum felt strangely hollow. He had imagined countless scenarios with Thaddeus over the years, confrontations, reconciliations, explanations, but never this, compassion for the dying man who had rejected him before birth. Outside, he called his mother. When she answered, her voice warm and familiar, he realized he was crying. "Cal, what's wrong?" "He's dying, Mom," Callum said, voice breaking. "Thaddeus is dying, and he wants to know me before he goes." The silence that followed contained 19 years of complicated history. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally, putting his needs first, as always. "I think I need to give him this chance," Callum admitted. "Not for him, for me." "Then that's what you should do," she said softly. "And Cal, I'll be here, whatever happens." Monday afternoons became sacred. Callum would arrive at Creighton Tower at precisely 3 p.m., riding the elevator to the top floor where Thaddeus waited. As weeks passed, their meetings migrated from the formal office to Thaddeus's penthouse apartment, a stunning space of glass and leather that somehow felt unlived in, like a magazine spread rather than a home. The conversations began awkwardly. Thaddeus asked about Columbia, about Callum's architectural studies, about his life in Chicago. Callum answered with careful restraint, revealing facts without emotion, building a wall of polite distance between them. But as Thaddeus weakened, visibly something shifted. Their discussions deepened. "Tell me about your childhood," Thaddeus requested one afternoon, oxygen tubes now a permanent fixture beneath his nose. Callum hesitated, then found himself sharing stories. His mother working double shifts to afford, his first bicycle, science fair projects built from recycled materials, Christmases that were modest but joyful. "She never spoke badly of you," Callum admitted. "She could have poisoned me against you, but she didn't." Thaddeus's eyes closed briefly, pain crossing his features that had nothing to do with his disease. "She was always better than I deserved." During their 5th meeting, Thaddeus asked a nurse to retrieve a leather-bound journal from his bedroom. "I never spoke much about my own childhood," he said, handing it to Callum. Perhaps that was part of the problem. The journal contained Thaddeus's earliest memories, growing up with a father who measured love in achievements, a mother who used affection as currency, a household where vulnerability was weakness and failure unforgivable. "I'm not offering excuses," Thaddeus clarified, "merely context. I became what I was raised to be, ruthlessly successful, emotionally bankrupt." Callum studied his father, seeing not the titan of industry but a man shaped by generational damage he hadn't been strong enough to break. "When your mother told me she was pregnant, I panicked," Thaddeus continued. "Doctors had confirmed I couldn't father children, a sports injury in college. I assumed betrayal because that's what my experience had taught me to expect. Trust was a luxury I'd never learned to afford." "You could have had tests done," Callum said, not accusingly but matter-of-factly. "Yes," Thaddeus acknowledged, "but that would have required admitting uncertainty. I was never good at that." As March turned to April, Thaddeus declined rapidly. Their meetings moved to the hospital, where machines beeped constant reminders of mortality and nurses spoke in hushed tones. During what would be their final conversation, Thaddeus seemed unusually alert, almost peaceful. "I've updated my will," he said without preamble. "Everything goes to you." Callum shook his head. "I don't want your money." "I know," Thaddeus replied with unexpected gentleness. "That's precisely why it should be yours. Not as payment or compensation, but as acknowledgement. You are my son, My only child. The best thing I never deserved. He reached for Callum's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. I've made arrangements for something else, too. A private investigator located your mother's parents in England. They never knew about you. I've established contact with details in my papers. Callum stared at him, stunned. My grandparents are alive? Very much so, and eager to know their grandson. Thaddeus's eyes held a hint of their former sharpness. Don't waste decades as I did, Callum. Time is the one commodity no wealth can purchase. That evening, as Callum prepared to leave, Thaddeus spoke once more. I never said these words to anyone and meant them, he murmured, consciousness fading. But I am sorry, Callum. Truly sorry. Callum squeezed his father's hand gently. I know, he whispered. Rest now. 3 days later, Thaddeus Creighton died peacefully in his sleep. The man who had spent a lifetime building monuments to his own legacy found his most meaningful connection in his final days, with the son he had once rejected but ultimately recognized as his greatest potential legacy. The cemetery overlooked Boston Harbor, ancient trees standing sentinel over generations of the city's elite. Elowen stood beside Callum as Thaddeus's casket was lowered into the ground, her face composed, her hand steady in her son's grasp. She had flown in for the funeral at Callum's request, not for Thaddeus, but for the young man who needed to properly close this chapter of his life. The service had been well attended by business associates and acquaintances, but noticeably absent of tears or genuine grief. A life built on transactions had yielded relationships of the same nature. As the last mourners dispersed, Callum and Elowen remained, watching groundskeepers begin their work. Are you okay? She asked softly. I think so, he nodded. It's strange. I barely knew him, yet I feel this loss. You're mourning what could have been as much as what was, she said. That's natural. They walked slowly through the cemetery, past elaborate family mausoleums and marble angels, until they reached another grave, simpler, with fresh flowers already placed upon it. Elowen Marie Bennett, beloved daughter, 1976. 2017. Callum knelt beside the headstone, placing the white roses they had brought. I still can't believe she died before I could meet her, he said quietly. Elowen squeezed his shoulder. Your grandmother would have adored you, Cal. She was kind, stubborn, and fiercely independent, just like you. After Thaddeus's revelation about her parents, Elowen had reconnected with her estranged family in England, healing wounds decades old. Learning her mother had passed just 2 years earlier had been painful, but discovering her father was alive and longing to meet his grandson had brought unexpected joy. Grandfather arrives tomorrow, Callum said, rising. He's eager to show us the family home in the countryside. It feels like everything's coming full circle, Elowen observed, connecting past to present in ways I never imagined possible. They left the cemetery in companionable silence, driving to the reading of Thaddeus's will. The lawyer's office was predictably austere, the proceedings formal. As promised, Thaddeus had left everything to Callum: the business empire, properties, worldwide investments, art collections, a fortune built over decades. What will you do with it all? Elowen asked later as they walked along Boston Harbor, the city skyline glittering across the water. Callum considered, watching boats sway gently at their moorings. I've been thinking about establishing a foundation for single parents pursuing education, providing scholarships, childcare, housing stipends, the things that would have helped you. Elowen's eyes shimmered with tears. That's beautiful, Cal. And I want to create an architectural scholarship at Columbia, one based on merit rather than connections. He paused. I thought we could name it after both of you, the Creighton Bennett Fellowship. The symbolism wasn't lost on Elowen, the joining of names that had once been torn apart, creating something meaningful from a painful history. As sunset painted the harbor in amber and gold, Callum reached for his mother's hand. I spent so long wondering about him, resenting his absence, but if he'd stayed, if he'd been different, My whole life would have unfolded differently too. For better or worse, Alawan agreed. I think I'm finally at peace with it, Callum said. With all of it. His rejection led to your strength. Your struggle gave me values money couldn't buy. Even his late acknowledgement has created opportunities to help others. Alawan wrapped her arm around her son's waist, leaning into his solid presence. From the moment I knew you existed, you gave my life purpose, she said simply. Everything else, the hardships, the victories, even this unexpected inheritance, it's all just been part of our journey together. As darkness fell over Boston, mother and son turned toward the future, carrying with them the lessons of the past but no longer burdened by its shadows.